Do you want to share your screen before we get started, or it's up to you? Oh, I can't hear you.
I can do that. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. It says I cannot screen share when another participant is sharing. So
Oh,
that's okay. I have my little mini window open. I
you have your
have my
setup.
main window open. Yeah, I have all my things in the background here. So I
Great.
might just like minimize the Zoom screen once we get going.
Okay.
Because I have a few things. It's okay.
All right. Sounds good. So what I'll do is at about 6:30, I'll just say, we'll give people a few more minutes to kind of trickle in.
Mhm.
And then Caroline will take down her slide, and I'll do like an intro, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. That sounds great.
Great. Good evening, everyone. It is just about 6:30. So I will give other people who will be joining us just a couple minutes before we get started. And as you can see, people are already writing in the chat where you're joining us from. All right, it is 6:32, so I think we will get started. Well, hi everyone. Before we dive into this evening's program, I just want to let you know, as you can see, that this program is being recorded and will be available on the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum's Facebook and YouTube pages, as well as dykemanfarmhouse.org after today. So welcome back to the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series, talking about Race Matters, Join the Conversation. My name is Meredith Horsford, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum. We are so excited to continue this lecture series that began in August of 2020, which was so successful that we've continued it as a biannual series. So thank you to those of you who are returning, and welcome to our newcomers. This has been a 3-week series centered on food culture and food justice. This series was created at a time of great unrest in this country due to the murder of unarmed Black people, as well as the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our goal throughout has been to encourage people to come together and engage in conversation about a topic that can sometimes be uncomfortable. We would like to thank you all for attending this series as we've learned about food culture, decolonizing food, and this evening, how content creators are disseminating information virtually. We are grateful to be able to offer a platform to share these inclusive stories with our community, our city, and those visiting from all over the world. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few useful features on Zoom, which you probably already know. Please use the chat box feature to say hello to our other attendees and to ask Caroline, our digital content and programs coordinator, any technical assistance questions that you might have. During the lecture, if you have any questions for our speaker, please, you can either type them into the chat or use the raise hand feature, and we will answer those questions at the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We feel strongly at the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum that our programming remains free of charge so that it is accessible to all. The response to this lecture series has been overwhelming, and there's clearly a need for us to talk more about the issues that divide us and the issues that unite us as Americans. As a small nonprofit organization, we rely on grants and donations to support these programs. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. If you would like to make a donation to help us continue our community-focused programming, it is greatly appreciated. Tonight, we are joined by our friend Aura Kemp, who holds a master's in public health and is the director of nutrition at New York Common Pantry. Sprinkle, share, chop, crop, fold, and follow. The recipe for a strong social media profile built to catalyze change is like perfecting a recipe. Some content requires a bit of spice, maybe a sweeter delivery, but the flavor needs to stay strong and pronounced, potent in its presentation, and uniquely you. Every post is a calculated dose of decolonization, a delectable dissemination of digital decadence, and an unfiltered taste of how food is ingrained in cultural traditions. Join us as we serve up social media as the amuse-bouche for catalyzing change. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Aura Kemp, presenting Here to Stir the Pot, TikTok as a tool for elevating culture and catalyzing change.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, thank you. Okay, I'm going to take 2 seconds just to get myself situated with all of my little screens and things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share part of my screen. I prepared a presentation, no sweat, like there's very little reading. Don't worry, this isn't like that kind of a lecture. It's more just to be able to provide some context so that you guys can follow along, but it's mostly meant to be a conversation. So once I get all of this lined up, we're gonna jump on in. Here we go. You guys should be able to see that now on your screen clearly. If you have any issues, again, just shoot a message over, let us know so that we can make adjustments as needed. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So thank you again for the wonderful introduction. The Dykeman Farmhouse Museum has been so much fun to be able to come in and talk about food. I really enjoy talking about food. So anytime I get a platform to be able to do that with others, I am so grateful. And this is no different. We are going to be sharing over conversation around food and how it relates to our culture and our community and how we can activate ourselves in spaces where we can really help to create change. So get ready. It's just about dinner time now. We will be talking about food. So if you're hungry, I suggest you go ahead and grab yourself a little bite of something. Welcome to everyone for joining in our conversation tonight, here to stir the pot. TikTok as a tool for elevating culture and catalyzing change. All right. Welcome to our table. My name is Kemp. I am a food equity advocate and the director of nutrition at New York Common Pantry. We are New York City's largest community-based food pantry, and we broke a record this last year, serving over 9.5 million meals. And it's crazy because I was just here last fall, and that number was 6 million. So you can tell we've done a lot of work over this last year to address hunger in our city. For those of you who may be visually impaired or on a device just listening in, I am a multiracial mid-30s female wearing a head wrap. I got my glasses on so I can see everything, a V-neck tank and blazer, seated in front of my plants. And my pronouns are she, her, and we. So welcome again to our table. And thank you to the Dykeman Farmhouse team for creating this space for us. Thank you to all of those who have come to feast on conversation and share in elevating our culture through food activism. I want to start by acknowledging a few key truths, and these truths will be a sort of like through line for us. They're going to help us throughout the conversation. I encourage all of you guys to, write into the chat, submit your questions. I really want this to be a dialogue between all of us. So the first key truth that we're going to hold at the center of our conversation tonight is that food is a right. Access to food is an inalienable right that we have. This is not up for debate. As creatures on this planet with knowledge and skills and abilities to feed ourselves, for us to not do so is inhumane. And in a land of abundance like ours, there's no humanity in 14 million households being food insecure. It's over 35 million people, and that is with our entire network of emergency food providers, our entire network of food banks. We still have millions upon millions of people in this country experiencing food insecurity. There is no dignity in that. We all deserve access to food. We're going to keep rolling into our second truth, and that is that the land holds our history. So a lot of our history books start with the discovery of a new world, but America was already a really rich tapestry of Native peoples, and that includes the Munsee Lenape and the Wappinger nations that lived right here in the Bronx, where I now reside, work, and serve my community. So food is deeply connected to that. It is impossible for us to disconnect ourselves from the land. It nurtures us and we nurture it. And how we honor that land, it guides us in how we continue to move forward in nurturing ourselves and how it is that we sow and share amongst our communities. The third key truth is that when we are at the table, we all share equally. And that is both in our successes and our failures, right? So when something hurts one of us, it hurts all of us. When something benefits one of us, it benefits all of us. And I'm a firm believer that like the strongest connections between people happen when we share a meal together. It's a very intimate experience, and we haven't really gotten to know each other until we've had a meal together. So the ritual of sharing is deeply embedded in us. It's how we bond. It's how we tell stories. It's how we passed on our histories. And the conversation tonight is an opportunity to continue sharing in that space and creating a space that is both safe and welcoming. And I encourage all of you to take part in that. So we're going to go ahead and get started by rolling into a really big question, and that is, what is culture? We hear it all the time. A workplace culture, a home life culture, all of these things. Culture is real, it exists. So what is culture? And there are a lot of different ways that we could answer this question, but the definition of culture is the customs, the arts, the social institutions, and the achievements of particular nations, peoples, or other social groups. So that's a pretty wide umbrella, right? Culture, it can be both shared and cultivated in many spaces. So in order for us to understand culture and in order for us to understand identity, we need to understand how these two things play together. So there can be a culture outside of people being involved within it. However, once we are connected to a culture, we use that as our cultural identity. And that refers to our identification with or our sense of belonging to a particular group based on various cultural categories. And this includes things like nationality, ethnicity, race, gender, and religion. We're going to dive in a little bit more. So, culture is a defining feature of a person's identity, a part of what makes them both an individual and part of the collective. It contributes to how they see themselves and the groups which they identify, right? So you can tell based on getting to know a person more about their culture, even if you are not familiar with their culture. They carry that culture with them, and you can learn about an individual without ever knowing them by learning about their culture. Their culture also carries them, right? So a person's understanding of their own and others' identities, it's developed from birth. It's shaped throughout time. So we're socialized into our culture. And it shapes the values and attitudes that are prevalent, usually within the home or within the surrounding community. So those third spaces, places outside of our home or our work, in which we socialize and connect with others. So how do we recognize cultural identities? So we do that in a few different ways, and we kind of categorize them, right? So the first one is gender identity. Our gender identity is influenced by the way we are treated by people like our parents or family members, the way that we're socialized within space. It's also by things like neighbors and friends. We often here in the States divide them into two gender identities, but there is a full array of gender identities. And in most cases, we look at it as qualities of either being more feminine, masculine, or androgynous, so somewhere in the middle. Now, the media today has a very strong influence on our identity, as well as whether or not we choose to accept or deny gender norms. So when we think of the impact of social media on shaping our cultural identity or our gender identity as a subpart of culture, there's a lot that plays into that and how that identity can change over time to either become more restrictive or more expansive. The next is age identity. And this is one that I don't think we often think about outside of like the workplace, you know, when we start to think about like senior or junior members and kind of how age plays into the overall culture of a space. But our age identity is also a really big aspect of our identity. And that's because different cultures view and treat people of different ages in different ways. For example, in many Asian cultures, a person getting older is seen as an honorable thing. So it's more encouraged for families to live in a multi-generational household as opposed to families separating and placing their older adult family member into assisted care or assisted living, something like that. It's more seen as acceptable and culturally expected for the younger adults in the family to take care of older adults, right? Now, that's not always the same in all cultures, right? While the older adults in our family might still be very respected, the responsibility for care is not always put on the younger members of a family. It is not part of that cultural standard or expectation. So it definitely balances out, right? The next one we often hear about is our spiritual identity. So depending on the culture and context, spiritual identity can be more or less apparent. So in some countries, people might even be ready to push themselves to extremes in order to show their dedication to their faith, whereas in other cases, it might be more passive. And the idea of spirituality is not necessarily tied to the idea of religion. It is more, it's a way that we are able to connect based on a shared value, right? So spirituality can definitely be a spectrum, but we find a lot of community and we create a lot of culture around our spiritual identity. And it's interesting because there are also instances like for Seventh-day Adventists where it's part of their religion that they do not consume any animal plant-based products. So Seventh-day Adventists tend to be vegans for their entire life. That is part of their spiritual identity, and that is part of the culture of Seventh-day Adventists. So that also ties into how it is that they operate in space and how it is that they consume or do not consume food. Another one is our class identity. And this one is an interesting one to observe, especially recently with like the death of the queen and all these, like there's been a lot of interesting conversation around class identity. So our social classes, and the class identity that we hold in those spaces, they influence how we behave, how we communicate, and how we communicate with people outside of our class identity. For some classes, they will even go as far as completely restricting access to anyone outside of their class identity. There is definitely a difference between being forced into separation and choosing separation as the baseline, and this is heavily influenced by things like class identity. So it's not necessarily noticed until someone goes into a different environment or is surrounding themselves with people from a different class that they start to really understand where they are on the social ladder. So that's also a very interesting one, because if you're never exposed to anything different, then you don't know that you are different, right? You don't know that not everyone lives that life, which is another big part we'll get into later around things like activism and visibility on social media. We also have things like our national identity. So a person's citizenship of a specific nation is referred to as their national identity. So this, of course, can change as someone like migrates within space. So if you're going into or out of a country, you can choose to, lay aside your previous nationality registration. You can choose to be part of a new nation. So this can also change. It can become very fluid. Also with the realization that like space is occupied. So space can occupy as well as recede, right? So that can also change because of circumstances outside of the individual. Like if Puerto Rico were to secede from the United States and become its own country, like that would be a state in which now we have a nationality that's outside of the United States, even though it used to be the US, right? Okay. And then we have things like regional identity. So in every country, there are regions within it that have their own identity that's specific to that space. So that's really around how it is that people settle over generations into a space and how it is that they then become connected to that land within that space. Remember, because we are all inherently connected to the land that we occupy, right? So this can carry a positive or negative, real or not real generalization about the people who live there, right? So we often think about Southern people, we'll say like Southern folks. They tend to be very like the idea of like Southern hospitality is a really big regional culture for Southern people specifically. They're known for being very welcoming and very warm, right? That is a regional identity. We're going to keep on rolling through here. Now, the last one is personal identity. So our personal identity means how we perceive ourselves. So our personal identity is vital for us. It's necessary for us to exist within space. And we communicate and negotiate our own personal identity with the other people around us, either inside of or outside of our cultural groups and cultural identity. Cool. Let's keep it rolling. All right. So we're going to talk a bit here about how this is represented in food, right? So food plus culture. How do these things collide? I think it's pretty easy because we all love to eat, right? So we understand a lot of this influence of food and culture. So people who are connected to their cultural group, they tend to also have patterns that are consistent in their diet and their food of that cultural group. So it's often used as a means of retaining our cultural identity. So people from different cultural backgrounds will eat different foods, and the areas in which people live, where their ancestors originated and had an influence on their diet, they'll carry with them even into today. And that includes both their food likes and their food dislikes. So we continue to make food that is influenced by our current state while still carrying forward our cultural traditions and our cultural norms as they've been provided to us by our ancestors and those who came before us. This can be a huge symbol of pride for many people. I know that my mom judges everybody based off of their peach cobbler. It's like the litmus test, you know? And it can also be a means of coping with emotional distress. Think of things like homesickness. And when you make a recipe that your mom or grandma made, and it's just like, it takes you back to that moment. It can be both healing emotionally, as well as helping us to reinforce those cultural identities and those cultural rituals around food in a way that nothing else can, right? Very powerful. So food is key. I know that I'm a little bit biased because I love food so much, but honestly, food, it is the key to our story as a human species, all right? Humans have changed the projection of our species through food, like, and the world through food, right? So cooking was the key to that evolutionary process. Up until we started cooking food, it took so much energy from the food that we were consuming raw to digest it and allow it to be absorbed into our bodies. The digestion process took so long and so much energy that we did not have enough energy to develop our brains until we started cooking our food. The second we started cooking our food, that preliminary process of preparing our food allowed for our bodies to absorb our food at a faster rate, which meant that all of the additional energy that we were bringing in could now go towards developing other parts of our body. So we developed our brains, and that is how we evolved into the humans that we are today. It's because of food. So this connection that we have with food, both the emotional connection and like this like intangible desire to be pleased from our consumption of food, this is like, enjoying food is not unique to humans. The emotional connection we have to enjoyment of food is. No other species has this emotional, deeply emotional connection to food like we do as humans. So food is so multifaceted in its connection to the human experience. What do I mean? Well, food, it's love, right? We all know what it's like to have someone prepare us a dish that they just like pour their whole soul into. It feels like eating a bowl full of love. It's memory. Smell is the strongest sense tied to our memory. So in the process of cooking, you are reactivating memories from your past and being able to relive those moments through food. It is our identity. Just like we were saying, it's a big part of our culture, right? It's how we share. It's how we maintain our stories, maintain our histories, share about our ancestors. It's through food. It's connection. Again, sitting around like sitting at a table and sharing a meal with people is our main and primary way to connect. It's also understanding. So you learn so much about a place, about a people, about a space and time by tasting food. It helps us to understand the lived experience of other people, the regions that people occupy, as well as the history and story of how a recipe may have developed or how it is that it came together. It is understanding. Food is creation. If you have ever tried to come up with a recipe of your own, or even sometimes recreating something that someone else made, you'll know that it is a creation process, not just in the preparation of food, but also in the growing and cultivating of food. It is all about creation. Food is also joy. I don't know if you could tell it from me, but I really get so much joy out of food. And I know that like food can be such a pleasurable experience, but it can also be such a joyous experience. Food is power. Food is power. And this is one that, especially around activism, is so important because we all need food in order to survive. So withholding food is an act of terrorism. To demonize food is an act of terrorism. And to waste and spoil food purposefully is an act of terrorism. Food can be so powerful. By controlling our food source, we can be controlled as a people. And by taking away our native and indigenous knowledge of the land and how to cultivate food for ourselves and nourish ourselves is at a detriment to ourselves. We all could have so much more power if we learned how to grow and cultivate our own food. And by controlling it within our state systems and these massive agricultural systems, we have that power stripped away from us. But it holds so much of who we are. That ownership of food is important, which is why I say that food is also ours. It's ours. The value of food comes from us because we nurture it, because we are the ones who want to see it continue to prosper and thrive. We give food power, and in turn, food gives us power. Isn't that so cool? All right, next up. So, what happens when we are severed from our cultural foods, or we are living in a state of food insecurity? Really think about that, right? If you're pulled away from your cultural foods and you are pulled away from your cultural group and identity, your own personal identity can be compromised. When you are living in a state of food insecurity, you don't have the ability to nourish yourself. You're immediately put in a state of urgency and stress. So when we talk about how powerful food can be, we aren't just talking about how powerful it can be, for changing the world and improving our health, but preserving our culture, keeping our identities safe and secure. It's so important. So, food culture, it's the collective practices, attitudes, beliefs, as well as the production, disruption, and consumption of food. So everything from seed to soul is part of our food culture. Now, how does this represent in our current foodscape? And what is American food culture? You might recognize some of the things on the screen. I think when we think about traditional, what is American food? What is American cuisine? This is often what we think of, right? Even though the influences on American cuisine include, indigenous peoples, the British, the French, the German, the Spanish, the Italians, as well as many Asian cultures. So many nationalities from the continent of Asia are represented, especially all across the West Coast in the United States, yet we don't often think of them as part of American food culture. And that is mostly because up until around the 19th and 20th centuries, the amount of migration coming into the United States was fairly limited. But with that additional influx in the 19th and 20th, of immigrants from different nations, we quickly saw our food culture diversify. It is truly a melting pot of flavors and cultures today. And if you don't believe me, just go over to the Queen's Night Market and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, right? There are still those pieces of regional differences and diversity in foods. There are certain areas that are known for specific kinds of dishes or plates. But when we think about what is American food culture, we can think less of it looking like this and more of it looking like this. So things like native and indigenous foods that grew here long before our country was colonized. It includes the amalgamation of flavors that happened all along the southern United States to create what we now know as Southern American cooking. It also includes things from our migration west, like Tex-Mex, the mixing of flavors of people from the Chicano tribes and all along the southernmost, what is now the southernmost border of the United States, which was Mexico. So all along the South, we see these interesting combinations of flavors like gumbo, which is a combination of Black and French cooking that was done in the South to create things like jambalaya, which is delicious, right? This is what is unique about American food culture. It is not just around the diversity of the food represented in it from its people, but it's also about the contributions by those cultures and how they were adopted and assimilated into what is now considered to be traditional American cooking. So who is it that contributes to food culture? Everybody. Everybody contributes to this American food culture. We are constantly reshaping it, right? But how would you know this if you looked at our history books? So A study back in 2015, the Diversity Baseline Study, looked at dozens of publishers and found that almost 80% of those who worked across publishing identified as white. So unsurprisingly, by 2020, the same data showed that only about 10% of the books on the New York Times bestseller list were authored by people of color. Now, on the Publishers Weekly list of 2017 cookbooks, nearly every single author in the top 10 was white. Oprah came in at number 5. But it was only after Ree Drummond, who was known as like the pioneer woman, who is a white woman that cooks essentially like very comforting Midwestern Southern style foods. And 2 cookbooks on there were about the Instant Pot, which is like a very new fatty thing, right? But Thug Kitchen is one that was very interesting. If you guys haven't heard of Thug Kitchen or the Thug Kitchen cookbook yet, you might think that maybe this was a cookbook authored by a person of color, but it was not. It's a cookbook that was written by a white couple who built their entire brand and persona for this vegan cookbook off of using Black stereotypes, Black language, and lots of profanity. So when people first saw their cookbooks growing in popularity, they associated it with cultural blackface. They were taking someone else's cultural identity and using it as a marketing ploy to sell their cookbook, right? Problematic all over the place. But this is not anything new, right? Because we have a history of erasure when it comes to talking about those who are prominent in the food space. So looking a bit further back, we can identify some of the most notable cookbooks from American history. And this is based on like food scholars and historians. The first one is Amelia Simmons. She wrote American Cookery in 1796. Now, this was believed to be the first cookbook printed by an American in America for an American audience. Now, it was really popular because this was the first time that she suggested using pearl ash as a leavening agent in baking. But there were other cookbooks who had been printed in the colonies in the New Republic that she also drew some inspiration from, including cookbooks by people like Hannah Glass. Now, Hannah Glass wrote The Art of Cookery, made plain and easy. It was originally written in 1747, but then that it was actually originally published overseas, and then she had it republished in the United States in 1805 because she started seeing that cookbooks for Americans were becoming more popular. And it's like, technically then, it's not even an American cookbook, but it is still praised as one of the most influential cookbooks of the Americas. Okay, the last one we're going to talk about is Mary Randolph. She wrote The Virginia Housewife in 1824. So this book, even until today, is still referenced by chefs and cookbook writers as an inspiration for authentic Southern cuisine. Now, let me just ask you something real quick. Prior to 1824, prior to 1800, who do you think was doing most of the cooking? Who do you think was spending the time in the kitchen, sweating away, making things like macaroni and cheese, or fried chicken, or black-eyed peas and collard greens? This cookbook today still is praised for its authentic Southern cuisine. But I truly wonder how many of these recipes were written by Mary Randolph. Not to mention, she included a lot of recipes for Italian, Spanish, French, and Caribbean dishes. And she has a few recipes in there that have very poor naming, but she pulls from flavors of these other places without ever crediting any of the people who actually introduced her to those flavors, right? This is the erasure that we talk about. Now, we're going to highlight some of the first cookbooks written by people of color. Now, mind you, most African Americans, most people who were taken through the mid-Atlantic slave trade and brought into the United States up until the point where they were endowed with their freedom, they did not know how to read or write. So the fact that Robert Roberts, what a name, was able to publish a book in 1827 was incredible. Okay. Not only that, but I would like to call attention to the name of this book, The House Servants Directory. Even though this book was like partially a cookbook, it was primarily geared toward how to act or how to conduct yourself as a house servant, not as a person within the household, right? So part of this is around speaking towards the expertise of being in a space and being able to perfect your craft. Part of it is also about what could be seen as marketable, right? So let's go on to the next one. Tunis Gulick Campbell, he wrote the Hotel's Keepers, Head Waiters, and Housekeepers Guide. It's a domestic guide that includes more recipes than the House Servants Directory. It includes recipes for things like lobster sauce, roasted eel, apple tarts. And what was really notable about this book is that it was more valuable for its instruction in interracial social skills. Its insistence that managers recognize the dignity of labor, and its emphasis on the need for workers to be educated, well-paid, prompt, clean, and competitive. So it wasn't just about cooking for other people. It was also about being able to exist within space with dignity, right? The next one, Melinda Russell wrote the Domestic Cookbook in 1866. It stands out as the oldest cookbook written by an African-American woman. It was rediscovered in 2000, meaning this book had been hidden from us for like over 140 years, right? Like, that's just crazy to me. Like, even more than that, right? Almost 240 years. Wow, 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 wow. That's nuts. Okay, so food historians looked at this and they really reflected back and they're like, wow, there's a lot in here that also can be lended to Roberts and Campbell as far as their reflection on how it is that they are ingrained and connected within space, right? So it's not just about providing cookbooks. It's not just about providing like recipes. It's also about how people are interacting with each other within space, right? And one more, I promise. Okay, so this is probably my favorite one. It's by Abby Fisher. And the title of this book is so magical. Fisher Knows About Southern Cooking. Talk about it, okay? This was published in 1881 by a former slave named Abby Fisher. And it was considered the first African-American cookbook, strictly an African-American cookbook, which is just absolutely incredible. Again, she was also influenced by people like Robert Roberts and Tunis Campbell's books. But again, like there are very few that were published, so they were all influencing each other during this time, right? Now, historical documentation leans towards stories from the power-dominant culture at that time, which often means that it leaves others within the cultural landscape under or unrepresented altogether. So diversifying space and documentation allows for establishing new cultural norms that promote and expand our understanding of underrepresented groups, and it's key to elevating our culture. Attempted suppression of this cultural representation within the social space is inherently violent. It stems from white supremacy. It's very easy to establish and hard to dismantle. And it takes generations for us to deprogram within society. So let's talk about instances from history in which the visibility of marginalized groups was elevated and it helped us to catalyze change for that cultural group. So during the Nazi Revolution of Germany from 1933 to 1939, the Diary of Anne Frank was a very potent way for us to understand the atrocities that were subjected upon the Jewish people during the Nazi occupation of Germany, okay? There are so many people who still feel a strong connection to that story because it allowed them to see the suffrage of someone underneath that system, an innocent suffering under that system for the first time ever. The next one is Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So the Selma to Montgomery marches were happening from March 7th, 1965 until March 21st, 1965. Now,
These were happening peacefully, and people were walking miles upon miles, peacefully protesting after a young teen was murdered. It wasn't until the televisation, so it wasn't until they televised the brutality that happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge that people were activated to putting their bodies on the line and being there to support for the civil rights movement and pushing it forward, right? Many white Americans did not believe that it was as bad as Blacks in the South said it was because they didn't see it. It was the visibility of it that activated them into change, right? The third one I'm going to talk about, the Stonewall Uprising in 1969. So from June 28th to July 3rd of 1969, the Stonewall riots or the Stonewall Uprising began in the early hours of June 28th. The New York City police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay club in Greenwich, which I'm pretty sure we've all heard this story, right? And it sparked a riot among the bar patrons and the neighborhood residents because police were they were just roughly hauling employees and patrons out of the bar, leading to 6 days of protests and violent clashes with law enforcement, both out on the street, in the neighboring community, and the park. And it served as the catalyst for the gay rights movement. So it wasn't until people were subjected to violence because of their cultural identity, and others were able to see that violence with their own eyes that they finally activated into creating change, right? So let's talk about activism. Some of the key things that I want you guys to think of is like, what is your message and how do you tell it? What is it that speaks to you, right? What is the thing that you're so passionate about that just being able to talk about it fuels your fire? Where is the place that you had struggle or you had resistance in being able to progress? Where was your hardship? Where was it that you can speak to a lived experience, right? When you activate from that space, you are unstoppable, okay? And social media can support with that activism, right? So what is unique about TikTok? Okay, so TikTok has a few benefits, right? The first one is that you have a direct line from your story to the ears of another person. Do you remember how we talked about culture, not just being about the individual, but about the group itself, right? Someone can be introduced to your culture for the very first time by opening up an app and swiping. That's powerful, especially when we have a history of erasure, right? If we can't trust what's documented to be telling the whole story of every person, then there's no better source for us to go to than the people with that lived experience. So platforms like TikTok make it possible for us not just to share our unique story with a wider audience, direct from us to them, but it also allows for people outside of our cultural groups to be able to experience firsthand what it is like to get to know us, or what it is like to be introduced to a new culture without needing to have that person right in front of them. It closes the distance between cultural groups. And that is one of the best parts of social media, but specifically TikTok. With the number of users on the TikTok platform and how quickly a post can go viral, which usually happens from engagement. So the more people who see it and interact with it, the more rapidly it will be pushed out to more people, right? So this is really helpful, especially if you're wanting to inform people about something that has been stagnant for a really long time, and it's time for us to expand it rapidly, right? We want to make big changes in a short amount of time. So this is because about 60% of the people using the platform, they believe that they have the power to change things in the real world, right? If they make enough noise online, they can instill actual change within the world. And this is for people within like the millennial range and younger, right? So these next generations that are moving in are like, I know that I can activate things and I can change stuff if I make noise on social media. The other thing is that we are able to organize in ways utilizing things like hashtags, utilizing things like tagging other content creators, using things like to reshare or recommend a post, which amplifies the original creator's content. What's incredible about that is that it gives much more power to the user to change the algorithm to push content that is culturally representative. So you were able to do things like find a really great content creator, whether they be in the educational realm, whether they be in the organizational realm, and you can amplify their voice by using your platform and your following. Now, there are some limitations to this, right? Because it is an open platform where you can essentially create anonymous profiles, there are things like trolls that exist there, right? Or bots that exist there that aren't real people. They might be created by a computer, and they'll do language analytics on posts and then just recreate similar communications on another post, but it might not be real or valid. There are also instances in which content can be flagged or can be said to have violated community guidelines, and there's no process for being able to effectively address and remove those community guideline violations from a profile. So there are times when some people who have built millions of people and following could get a number of community guidelines violations from a bot account and have their entire account removed. The platform itself can help to amplify things rapidly, but can also be taken away just as quickly, which is why it's important to remember that activism is not just about what we do online. It's about utilizing a social media platform to catalyze people into real life action. And we're going to talk about that next, because it can be used to elevate us and elevate our culture, introduce people to what it is that we're doing outside of their norm. But it means nothing if we don't link it to real world action. So let's talk about really activating our community for change. There are many ways to activate. All right. Now, the first thing that you can give is time, right? Not everybody is going to be a TikToker. Not everybody's going to understand technology. Not everybody's going to want to be in that environment, right? But sometimes what we have is time, right? So we're able to maybe not create content, but we can go onto the platform and we can reshare and amplify the voices of people that are out there doing the work, right? We might not have the know-how or knowledge or ability, but we recognize that the work that they're doing is valuable. So we invest our time into supporting that work. Maybe it's volunteerism. Maybe somebody else already has everything and they just need somebody to help them with the management of it. You know, dedication of time is a hot commodity, especially when there's so much work to be done. You know, more, what do they say? Many hands make light work, right? Some of us can give time, so that's what we're able to provide. The other is structure. Think of this like organizational structure, right? So whether that be helping to coordinate calendars, whether that be helping to create tools, whether that be helping to communicate tools, so share, like resource sharing with others. Structure can be exceptionally valuable when it comes to activating more people. So maybe it's about being able to have a larger network for communication, right? Someone can help to create that structure. Just like I said, TikTok can't be the only place that you're using to be able to activate people. So maybe it's also creating a mailing list and keeping people connected in a more tangible and sustainable platform, as opposed to just relying on social media platforms alone. Another is an information, right? I told you that culture is unique to each of us, right? So there might be things about your experiences within your cultural groups that I'm completely ignorant to because I've never been exposed to it. But you have that information. And because you have that information, you have the opportunity to share it with a wider audience and make it more accessible and available for other people. It's like source citing, right? So when you learn a new piece of information, you're like, oh, I'm going to remember that. Then you can actually refer back to the original source of that information. Being able to create that same kind of structure within the social media environment, specifically on TikTok, is so valuable. Being able to, again, amplify the voice of the original creator, as well as being able to add additional context and narrative from your own lived experience within a cultural group. And the last one I want to talk about is collabing. Let me tell you something. Collaboration is the community building of activism. It's through collaboration, right? We all learn skills, right? I'm like Liam Neeson right now. We all have a very specific set of skills, right? Those skills can help contribute to others who might not have all of those tools. This is where that structure and communication really comes in, right? We can collaborate with others so that our collective work of addressing these barriers and challenges within our foodways, within our communities, can be done on a larger scale with much more detail and precision than if one of us was doing it alone. The American ideal of individualism is at the opposite end of community and collective activism. You cannot create change as an individual without having a collective behind you. Those two things together are what is necessary for us to create lasting change, right? And through giving in whatever way we can to that collective, we're able not to just dismantle our current oppressive systems, but able to dream up a new equitable society in which all of us are well cared for, are respected and have dignity, and are able to contribute to the continued prosperity of each of our independent groups together. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now because that is all I have for you guys today. I would love to hear questions. I would love to hear any of the things that were added in the chat box, and I'm happy to answer any others that you guys might have.
Thanks, Aura. Questions,
Yeah.
anyone? You can use the raise hand function. You can type it in the chat. I know one question we had. Let's see, I've got it right here. What are some strategies that you use when people are negative on social media, whether it's toward you or others? How do you come at that?
That's a great question. I handle them in different ways depending on the situation. You can usually tell by the interaction if someone is interested in actually like learning more, or if they're just wanting to be kind of combative.
True.
I had an instance recently where talking about utilizing TikTok for activism. If you guys check out my page, the Bodega Bites on TikTok, you'll see this kind of like story of it. Yes, this is an example of real life activism or real world activism. So my main train is the 6 here in the South Bronx, and it's on the same exact block as our police precinct. So they have closed off the entire block and they double park their work vehicles on that block, but then they also park their personal vehicles on the neighboring blocks up and down the street, which is also like catty corner to an elementary school. So there are a lot of buses coming through, to the point where like there are so many vehicles on the street that they will double park, making it only possible for one lane of traffic to flow through, and they'll block sidewalks and crosswalks. So the entire intersection is almost impassable for pedestrians. Now, 70% of the people in my neighborhood utilize public transportation in order to get around. So if people are not able to access safely their transit, their main form of transportation, it means that they're also being hindered from being able to do things like go to work, go to school, and stuff like that. Not to mention we have a lot of families in my neighborhood, lots of kids, and it's right there close to a school. So about a few weeks back, they had come in and they started redoing a bunch of the curbs, right, where the recess was to go into the street. They ripped everything up. In the process, they knocked down one of the crosswalk signs. It was just like dangling down on its wires. They for 6 weeks, they left the street unfinished. They had ramps that were supposed to go from the sidewalk to the street, but the cars were parked on top of them, so no one could use them. And I was coming off of the train one afternoon, and I had passed the police precinct, and I was walking towards the intersection, and I hear this woman scream, and I look across the street,
and this woman is on the ground holding her child. And I went over to see if she was okay. Her son had walked into the street because the crossing signal said for him to go. But that's the same crossing signal that had been knocked down while they were redoing the streets. And they decided to try and rehang it using tape and rope. And when they hung it up, they had the signs facing the wrong direction. So the child was walking into the street following the crosswalk sign, but that wasn't the correct sign to be displayed. With all of the cars double parked, with the curbs being all like messed up and unable to navigate, it was just like a combination of things that were unsafe for pedestrians. So my blood was a little hot. I made a quick little video and I just like went through the whole intersection, just documenting what was there, making what is normally invisible visible to more people. Because I never see stuff like that on the Upper West Side. I never see things like that on the Upper East Side. And that's just a few stops away. So why is it acceptable then to do it in my neighborhood when more people rely on public transportation, where there are more people with disabilities and mobility issues than the Upper East or Upper West, and there are more children per household in my neighborhood than the Upper East or Upper West? Why is this the most unsafe neighborhood, right? And why is it being done by our police? So I put them on blast on social media. And immediately, everybody immediately was like, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. It's always been that way. These were the kind of comments I was getting from people like, why are you complaining on social media? Right? That was one of the comments I got. But by complaining on social media, specifically on TikTok, where I knew that enough people in this city can relate to this challenge, this barrier in safety and accessibility, because it happens everywhere, that it would get enough engagement for the right people to see it. Because I'm on my community board. I've talked to the police about this directly multiple years in a row. I also go to City Hall and talk to elected officials all of the time. They come to every community board meeting and I bring it up every single time. I have brought this issue up for years around the double parking. And then I also had the opportunity to bring it up when they had additional barriers to our accessibility and safety in place. So that day I posted. The next day it blew up. People do the work for you. You know, I said like some people can contribute time and amplify voices. That's what happened. People started amplifying what was happening in my neighborhood. And within 2 days, they came out and fixed every single curb. They fixed the sign and the police stopped parking in the intersection. It took 2 days of putting them on blast on social media for people to make change. Now, there were those people who were like, why are you complaining about it on social media? So I made another video in response to that. And I was like, why do I complain on social media? Look at this. Look at this. And I just got to record what it looks like after you make noise about an issue in your neighborhood. Calling 311 oftentimes does not work, especially if you've been in a neighborhood for long enough to know that like you can look up all the 311 calls about this thing and they won't do anything about it. Taking something to social media takes it out of the current construct that is set up to hear our concerns, but not actually address them because there's no accountability there. When you put something on social media and point the finger directly at the person who is perpetrating, it immediately brings accountability to that situation where there was not any before. They didn't care whose problem it was or whose cars it was that were parked there. It looked bad on all of them to do that. So all of them stopped. The same way that it looks bad for the city to leave walkways like that, which are ADA violations, American Disability Act violations, the city could be sued for that. That woman whose child was almost hit by a car could have sued the city for that. And she would have been in the right because they hung up the sign improperly. Things like that should not be happening in our communities. So when you call out things directly, you're able to build an accountability, and then people will always troll you. Sometimes it's a learning opportunity. Sometimes I use it to like further explain an idea or issue, or I'll make recommendations on ways that they can learn a little bit more. Or like I'll ask them, have you read this book before? I would strongly suggest that one to you. Sometimes they respond, they're like, I don't need to read a book. And I'm like, then you're not really interested in learning. And this is a learning space, you know? Sometimes you just have to block them. The block function has become my best friend. There are enough people on the platform that the right people will still be able to find you, even if you start eliminating others. I feel like having access to that kind of information from someone who's willing to provide it should be seen as like a contribution to the group.
Like, it's a lot to create content on a consistent basis and stay relevant in this space that like consumes your information in little 30-second segments, you know? Like I've literally committed my entire life to doing this work, and some people want these very big issues explained in 15 seconds. I'm like, I can't do it all, you know? But like, this is why like it's really helpful to have a platform like that, because those who do want to learn more will ask very interesting and like kind of like probing questions to give you opportunities to share more and to give more. And all of that engagement helps to further propel the message and amplify the voice of people who are creating content.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One other thought I had, and people can certainly feel free to check you out at the Bodega Bites on TikTok and see what your content is like. But I'm curious if you could just give like a general kind of overview for how you personally have decided to interact with food and culture on TikTok.
Yeah. So, you know, when I first started, I was very apprehensive. I'm not a social media person. I do not like social media. And what I really wanted to do was try and bring awareness to the foodscape in my neighborhood specifically. So in New York State, my neighborhood ranks 62 of 62 for health outcomes out of every county in New York State, right? So we are dead last for health outcomes. We have the least amount of recreational space out of any neighborhood in New York City. We have the highest density of public housing out of any neighborhood in New York City. And when I first moved into my house, they rezoned the lot across the street, which used to be a park, and put up an 8-story building. We are rapidly losing access to open space and green space. We have like the Con Edison facility just over there past Randall's Island. We have some of the highest air contamination out of any neighborhood in New York. That's leading to increased, child asthma and a lot of like breathing issues and difficulties within my neighborhood. And on top of all of that, we have 23 bodegas for every one grocery store in my neighborhood. So there is an overabundance of highly processed and packaged food and very limited resources for the things that we know protect, preserve, and promote our health. So I started the Bodega Bites originally because I wanted to share recipes, like walking into my bodega, picking out a few ingredients off of the shelf, combining them with other ingredients that I have at home to make a quick and healthy meal, right? Because that's the kind of like functional knowledge that I think is really beneficial for people in my neighborhood. And then I realized once I started sharing that people were like, what's a bodega? And so then I was like explaining a little bit about like, this is a bodega. It's like, a lifeline for a lot of people in their neighborhoods, the only place that we can gain access to food. And they were like, what kind of stuff is in a bodega? So then I started kind of like showing them that. And they're like, where are all the vegetables? I'm like, we don't have any. And then like just being able to kind of open it up and starting to realize that like a lot of people they've never lived in a neighborhood like mine. So when we talk about food deserts or food apartheid, they have no understanding of what that even looks like. So I decided to start using my platform to show people what my neighborhood is like, to show people what it's like for some of the most densely populated neighborhoods in New York City to live that are underinvested and have been perpetually over policed, and so I really got into it for that purpose, for being able to share more about my neighborhood. And now it's kind of a collective of like updates in food policy and food access, how we go about like elevating culture. So even getting to call attention to things that people might not be aware of that are like representations of white supremacy ideology within our food system. So things like going to your local grocery store, and let's say that you're someone of Asian descent and you're trying to find, a specific kind of condiment, you have to go to the international aisle to find it. It's like, but why though? Why? We've had Asian immigrants in our country since like the westward expansion. Like, I don't understand why it is that we still have to go to the international aisle. You can go in and find like imported mustard from Germany with the condiments, but you have to go to the international aisle to find an Asian style mayonnaise made in New Jersey. Like it just makes no sense, So things like that is really hard for me to understand why they still exist, like why we still have like things like this in our day-to-day that exist. But then it's also the realization that like for other people who have never experienced it, they don't know. So this is again like a piece of that like class identity. Like for some people who have never lived in a neighborhood with a bodega, they have no idea what I'm talking about. But by coming to my page, they're able to see it for themselves and they're introduced to a culture that's completely different from theirs. And that's how we dismantle systems that are oppressive, is by letting people see like, no, we're real people who live here and we need this too. We deserve this too, you know? Even things like the fact that there's no year-round green market in the Bronx, the only borough that doesn't have one. And it's like, why not? We have the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center, which is the largest import of produce on the East Coast. And we can't keep any of it in our own neighborhood? Really? So things like that. I talk about stuff like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions before we let Aura go for the evening? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, Aura, as always, this was amazing and so interesting. So we greatly, greatly appreciate you being here with us tonight.
Of course. I'm always happy to come in and talk food anytime.
Well, you're so passionate and enthusiastic about it. You know, you can't help but get excited.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you guys so much. And I would love to connect with you guys if you ever want. I'm always around. You can find me on TikTok or Instagram, same names, the Bodega Bites. I'm out here.
Sounds fantastic.
Awesome.
I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue offer free public programming. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. We'd like to thank you again for attending this and our other lectures in the Talking About Race Matters Join the Conversation series. Recordings are available for all of the lectures from this series on our website. Stay tuned and please follow us on social media and follow the Bodega Bites as we continue our engaging programming and events throughout the year. We hope to see you all soon in person. Thank you all and have a great rest of your evening. Thanks again, Aura.
Of course. See you guys.
Night.